Thank you, Stefan, and thank you for inviting me here. It's great to be at this wonderful conference. I will start by emphasizing that increased inequality, movement of people across national boundaries, and refugees create major challenges and pressing concerns for schools and local communities. And it is reasonable to argue that the issue of inequality is one of the most pressing concerns, and therefore we need to think about how to address this challenge, and it should inform of a vision of leadership for the future. And the concern is driven by increased awareness of achievement gap across cultural groups, and also about critical analysis or deficit thinking that permeates schools' policies intended to address these gaps. And often policymakers conclude that the existing achievement gaps is the fault of failing schools, and it is argued that expectations are too low, teachers are insufficiently qualified, curricula are badly designed, classes are too large, school leadership is unfocused. But I will follow the economist Richard Rothstein when he emphasizes that this perspective is misleading because it ignores how social class characteristics in a stratified society actually influence student learning in schools. So a main argument in this presentation is that such challenges can no longer be addressed in isolation at the local school. It requires a coordinated global response. And although we should never underestimate the power of schools and educators to influence student learning and learning environment, as we have heard a lot about at this conference, the out of schools factors associated with poverty or racism will always play a powerful role, and hence will limit what can be achieved in schools. So without social and economic reforms to accompany reforms in schooling, the achievement gap will persist also in the future. So therefore, we need to ask, what is the direction which policymakers, administrators, and educational leaders should take in order to serve the needs for all students? And the purpose of this presentation is to put notion of social justice and equity at the forefront of our thinking in terms of school, educational leadership, and student learning in the future. It is a normative point of departure because it is about raising questions about purpose, content, and relationships in education. But how does socially just schooling look like? Here I will draw upon the definition provided by Martin Scanlon and George Theoharis. And they say socially just schooling is evident when educational opportunities flourish for all students, when ambitious goals are held and met by all students, when all students and families are made to feel welcome in the school community, and when students are proportionately distributed across all groupings in the schools, and when one dimension of identity, such as one's race or home language or gender or sexual orientation, does not directly correlate with undesirable aspects of schooling, such as being bullied, struggling academically, or dropping out of school. It is hard to predict or anticipate the future, and identifying the trajectory and possible effect of current global trends is a risky business, as it represents building on what we know today and hypothesize into the unknown. And further, our images of the future are influenced by the dominant discourse of what counts as educational success today, how we grasp, appreciate, or critique the present, and also by our construction of the past. It is about addressing key issues today and also counterbalance past neglect. So the structure of my presentation goes like this, that in the first part, I will, based on analysis of current reforms of public education, briefly sketch some global trends which are deeply influencing the way we think about education and educational leadership. And I will use my first part of the presentation to demonstrate and argue that trends towards marketization and privatization promoted by OECD and a number of other influential international agencies are moving ahead so rapidly that our current notion of leadership and educational policies fail to adequately capture what is going on in school and what should be going on if the goal is to equalize learning for all students. Hence, there is a need for scrutiny of current trends because we so easily get seduced by them. And the second part will deal more specifically on the way forward to a more socially just education. And it includes how leaders will need new perspectives to locate new landmines and the need for establishing an alternative accountability system for schooling. But first, some reflection about the global educational landscape in which we live and work. So we know, and we have heard about it here at the conference as well, key drivers of educational reforms across countries include both globalized educational competition and dramatic advances in information and communication technologies. And these drivers are not new, but the effect of them has intensified in recent years. And the flexibility offered by the technologies enables more individualized learning, and it facilitates the formation of new communities of practice. So we will need to rethink space and time. We also know how high-stakes testing regimes have been introduced as a response to disturbing results on national tests. And this is the case even though we have many studies that have demonstrated that such strategies for accountability don't work if the aim is to improve education for all students. However, scholars from the economics, for example, Hanushek and Washman, they argue that these policies are held accountable for developments they just made visible but did not create. So therefore, I will agree with Stefan Hoppmann, who has argued that we should explore other ways of using such accountability measures instead of collecting data in a binary mode of evidence for and against the current use of accountability measures, and address how such development come about, but also the leeway that is available for school leaders, teachers, parents, students in the current policy climate. Neither testing nor lack of testing procedures solve the problem of social inequality and difference. The problem with benchmarking is that they tend to produce discouragement as well as incentive to teachers and students struggling academically with various kinds of problems. And in addition, it drives distortion of curriculum as a result of teaching to the test. And it also increases the game-playing strategies of those with the most existing cultural capital to maintain their position. And we know that OECD has gained a prominent position in setting the agenda of educational policy by providing indicators for best practices and by constructing a global policy field of governance by comparing across countries. International league tables based on PISA results influence national debates about education, and the growth of scientific statistics has become a dominating reasoning, and this creates a belief that the more data we gather and the more comparison we do, the more we will know. However, comparisons are less about serving the purpose of education for all students in different contexts. It's more about hierarchies of performances. Differences between educational systems are downplayed in order to establish comparability between cases. And I will argue that within the OECD reports, it is not acknowledged that seemingly politically neutral models of best practices are still politicized. And OECD has published numerous of reports, so let me just show you a few here. And these have been heavily quoted by politicians and administrators, and if you read green papers or white papers from different countries, particularly in the Western world, these are quoted. And to provide an example from Norway and Sweden, it has been demonstrated how national developments in these two countries are intertwined with the OECD policy recommendation. And it demonstrates how education in Norway and Sweden early on served as a role model for education and social welfare within OECD. But with the publication of the first PISA test, the OECD's educational epicenter moved from Scandinavia to high-performing countries, such as Finland, as we all know, or other high-performing countries. So both Norway and Sweden have now become countries in need of advice from the OECD in order to raise their educational performances. And although the basic Nordic values for schooling seem to persist, today the ideals of publicly funded schooling and inclusive, comprehensive school systems are challenged by international ideals of competition, outcomes orientation, and accountability. But in addition to OECD, during the last decades, a number of influential international agencies have emerged, ready to offer their help to interpret school results and make recommendation for specific national proposal for educational improvements. And the concept edu-business captures the growing role of non-governmental organizations, for example, like Pearson or McKinsey, and they are actually defining educational standards. And reports from such organizations provide pathways for policy decision makers on how to maintain or improve the organizational features of educational systems. And these organizations, they motivate their existence with the argument that as school systems do not examine themselves in terms of success, the expertise of the company can contribute to international educational improvement. However, the mission is twofold. One aim is to help people to learn, and the other one is to make profit. So the use of data in education has to a large degree evolved into a specific technology for framing education by numbers. And closely related to the creation of edu-business is the exponential proliferation of technological advancements. And internet-based learning technology is rapidly dissolving the boundaries previously attached to national policy development. So it means that geographic boundaries have become blurred, and it has also facilitated the transfer of knowledge and enabled each country to compare students' performance and policies with other countries. But the downside of this development is how international benchmarking may lead to simplistic causal conclusion from aggregated data, and also uncritical transfer and adaptation of best practices. Because the technique of recognizing successful education system is largely based on the numerical data of student achievement. And such a policy permits education to focus on uniformity to the exclusion of difference, equity, and social justice. And I will also argue that the leadership models offered by this supranational organization are usually decontextualized and rarely address political dimension of this type of work. And as a result, they leave school leaders vulnerable in believing that they are engaging issues of power when they are not. And studies across many European countries have shown how principals have been increasingly experiencing a work environment in which contracting, outsourcing, public relations, benchmarking, and test scores have taken center stage. So standards have become a mantra for school reformers, and many countries have been experiencing an increasing trend toward developing a culture of performativity. And a lot of faith is put into assessment tools that provide this data. But as a result, the production of knowledge about schools and system is affected, and problems such as educational disadvantage tends to be framed as technical issues. So, the analysis I have provided so far of current reforms of public education might give a rather gloomy picture, and it might lead to a pessimistic view of schools for the future. However, there are alternatives for pursuing a broader person of education. But first, a warning. We should not engage in a romantic retrospect for good old public education that we might have lost or are about to lose. We know that public education in the past too often was incapable of effectively promoting practices that were culturally responsive or ethically sound. In shaping the school of the future, school leaders will need new perspectives to locate new landmines. And it includes reading and understanding the larger social and policy environment in which school leaders work. So there is a need for a careful analysis of the changing nature of larger social, economic, and political context surrounding the school curriculum, and we need to develop collective strategies to limit the failing effects of educational inequalities. Market-based discourse do more than shape policy and curriculum. They may also influence the way we all think and understand ourselves as professionals. And it may replace an ethos of public service by the discipline of the market. And although future educational leaders will have to deal with the realities of marketization and privatization, also in the future, they and we all do not have to buy into the corporate myths that business community is promoting. But the public has a right to know how well schools are educating future citizens. And that's why collecting data about school improvement and student achievements is important. However, those who shape accountability systems for schooling should also be held accountable for doing it in a responsible way. It is necessary to operate on two fronts simultaneously. And it is possible to imagine a different future for education, one that is not ruled by neoliberal ideology. The inequality which the educational system has generated and reproduced has, for example, become the core of social movement led by students. And I heard at the European conference this year about the student movement in Chile. I heard about social movement led by parents in New York City. And it involves key issues regarding education reform and practices we need to address to fulfill a mission of equalizing life chances for all students in the future. It is about counteracting the cultural and social segregation. And while it is legitimate to measure and evaluate how well schools are performing to inform education policy, it is a main problem that the discourse of equity within the OECD reports is mainly connected to the framework of increasing excellence in literacy and numeracy. So the talk about closing the gap reflects a highly reductionist and narrow view of equity, where notions of social justice and equity have been re-articulated to performance indicators on national and international tests. There is a need for a broader view on social justice. And even though this report briefly mentioned that education policies need to be aligned with other government policies, such as housing and welfare, to ensure student success, the recommendations are mainly connected to improvement within organizations and place unrealistic expectation on the role of schools in equalizing students' learning outcome. So as researchers, school leaders, parents, we have a responsibility to challenge this discourse collectively, a discourse in which the current policy agenda for equity is embedded. At least we should begin imagining more comprehensive strategies to address new challenges of educational inequality. We know that educational leadership enacts values and vision for the future, but school leaders should not believe that they have the same agenda as the business community, because the primary goal of business is return on investment to stockholders. First and foremost, we need to recognize that the school as an organization is political, and school leaders must exercise the political skills necessary to navigate the politics of organization. Serving the needs of all students will mean resisting the temptation of corporate ideology. I follow Gert Bista when he emphasizes how the purpose of education is three-dimensional. It concerns context, content, traditions, and the formation of person. And these three dimensions can never be separated. First, education is about the transmission and acquisition of knowledge and skills. Second, education is about socializing. Third, education affects students' personal developments. And Bista is arguing that these three domains are always at stake in education, and that all education in some way needs to attend to. It provides a starting point for countering trends that seek to reduce education to only one of these domains. There are still opportunities for school leaders, in collaboration with parents and teachers, to use their relatively autonomy to act against the policy grain in the interests of their students, as examples from social movements have shown. So, in this presentation, I have argued that notion of social justice and equity need to be at the forefront of a way of thinking about education and educational leadership. So let me end this presentation by quoting Gert Bista. He is worth quoting at length, as he emphasizes how education can never avoid questions about values and about desirable directions for education. So schools and those working in schools, leaders included, always have a duty to critically examine all the demands and desires that society puts on them, and to do so from the perspective of their educative responsibility. The school, from this perspective, is therefore not just functional for society, but also has a duty to resist. Thank you for the attention.